As an international student, it's extremely important to understand what tax documents you're supposed to be filing so you stay in compliance with the U.S. tax code. Now, the tax code, the U.S. tax code, is pretty complicated, and there's all kinds of different documents and forms and schedules that require filing. So as an international student, there's that additional layer as to what actual form am I going to be filing. Well, my name is Brian Winrow. I'm a tax attorney and tax professor, and I often work with students who run into these types of issues trying to figure out what am I supposed to file. So I've decided to go ahead and do a playlist that talks about some of the different issues that international students run into. And in this video, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about the difference between the 1040 and the 1040 NR. So the 1040 is the thing that you generally hear about in the US because that's what most US citizens are going to be filing. So it's very easy to think that you have to file a 1040 as well, but that's not always the case. So let's look at the difference between the 1040 and the 1040 NR, and we'll just start with the basic broad overview. All right, so let's look to see who has to file the 1040 and who has to file the 1040 NR. Now, if you have a US citizen or if you're a tax resident in the United States, then you go ahead and you file the 1040. Now, if you're in the US, you're going to see that there is a huge bias toward the 1040 because that's what most people in the United States are filing is that 1040. So even some of our tax programs out there are biased toward the 1040. If you're an international student or a non-tax resident in the United States, then you're using the 1040 NR. That's the case for almost everybody. Now, if you're a student from India or if you're in a business apprentice, that can change. That is an exception to it, but most are going to be required to do the 1040 NR. Now, there are some big differences between the two, and we're going to go into some of those differences, and they will relate to things like filing status and whether you can claim dependents and whether you're going to be taxed on your worldwide income. So we're going to get into those details. But the first thing you need to know is you have to be doing the 1040 NR in most instances if you're an international student. In addition, you're going to be filing a Form 8843 every single year. Now, the 1040 NR is only filed if you have some type of income, which is going to be things like excess student loans, so you student loans that exceed your tuition and fees, or W-2 wages or 1099, things like that. Now, if you don't have any income, you still do the 8843, so remember to always look at that 8843. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the U.S. tax code, I have an entire playlist that walks you through the 1040 line by line, so you can check that out and understand how the U.S. tax system is set up. But what I'm primarily doing here is distinguishing between our 1040 and our 1040 NR. So let's continue to see the differences, and we'll start with the 1040. So those filing a 1040, first thing, you're going to be taxed on your worldwide income. So let's say you're a U.S. citizen and you make income working in the United States, that's going to be taxable income. Or let's say you're a U.S. citizen and you're a digital nomad. You are working outside the United States. You moved out of the country. Well, you know what? You're still going to be taxed on that income because the U.S. taxes you on your worldwide income. Now, also, one of the distinguishing features when you're looking at a 1040 is you have more choices in terms of your filing statuses. So you could be a head of a household, you could be married filing jointly, you could be single. So you have a lot of options on there, a qualifying surviving spouse. So there's different types of filing statuses. And you get to claim dependents if you have any dependents. So that also helps you in terms of your taxes. Another feature is you get to choose between taking the standard deduction or itemizing your deductions. Now, the standard deduction means that you're taking a standard deduction that reduces your taxable income, to an itemized deduction, you're looking at certain deductions that you can add together like mortgage interest or state taxes, and you would include those types of things. And if your itemized deductions are greater than your standard deduction, you would take the itemized deductions. But importantly, you are able to take the standard deduction if you choose as opposed to the itemized deductions. We're going to see on the 1040 NR, that's not something that actually exists. And then finally with the 1040, one of the nice features is that you get tax credits if you qualify for them. So when you're looking at these deductions above, right, the standard deduction or the itemized deductions, what those do is they reduce your taxable income, and then your taxable income is going to be applied with your tax rate. Now, when you're looking at it in terms of a credit, what happens is we've now calculated your taxes, and a credit reduces your taxes dollar for dollar. So if you owed $1,000 in taxes, but you have $700 in tax credits, now you only owe $300 in taxes. Now, these are features that do not apply on the 1040 NR. So let's go look at the 1040 NR so that way we're getting a better comparison between the two. So let's now look at the 1040 NR. Now, when we're looking at the 1040 NR, the differences between the 1040 and the 1040 NR become much more pronounced because we can start seeing those differences. The first thing that we should note is when we looked at the 1040, we said that the tax base was worldwide income. Well, here, now we're only looking at U.S. sourced income. It has to be income that's coming from the United States. So it's U.S. sourced income. So if you're working a W-2 wage, you have that campus job, you have a 1099, those things are going to be included here. The filing statuses differ as well. So when you were looking at the 1040, we said your filing statuses could have been single, head of household, married filing jointly, married filing separately, and then it would have also been the qualifying surviving spouse. When we look at it from the 1040 NR, we don't get the options of a head of household, and we don't get married filing jointly, and that can be pretty significant. Then what we look at are dependents. Now, in the 1040, you get to claim your dependents. On the 1040 NR, outside of Canada, Mexico, South Korea, and India, if they meet tests, then you don't get to claim the dependents. So that's a huge disadvantage, is that the dependents are not something that you can claim on a 1040 NR. Same thing with the standard deduction. You generally do not get to take the standard deduction on a 1040 NR. So that's not going to be something that you can do. What you usually have to do is you have to itemize, and you itemize on your Schedule A. And what's going to happen with that is you're limited to the type of deductions that you can take even as an itemized deduction. So it's not as broad as what you would see on the 1040. So the 1040 NR is more limited with that regard. And then you can see there are possible treaty benefits. So there can be some benefits, even though you're still going to have to file, there's going to be some benefits available to you that would not be available on a 1040. So there is some benefits to the 1040 NR. Now you can look at this and see these differences, but this is one of the reasons why it's so important to understand whether you should be filing the 1040 or the 1040 NR, because if you're not filing using the correct form, your taxes are going to be way off because you may be claiming certain types of deductions or credits that you may not be entitled to, or you might even be missing some opportunities with some of the benefits. So you want to make sure that you're filing with the correct form, and you're not going to get in trouble when you go ahead and file and get letters from the IRS saying, hey, you shouldn't have been using that type of form or something like that. All right, well, let's continue on. So what are the tests to determine whether we're going to be filing with the 1040 or the 1040 NR? Look, if you're on a visa, the F, the J, the M, the Q, you're probably going to be doing the 1040 NR. Now, here's the actual test that would be applied. The first one's going to be the green card test. It makes you a resident for tax purposes if you hold a lawful permanent residency. So if you hold that green card, then you're going to be doing the 1040. Or if you meet the substantial presence test. Now, that's based upon the number of days that you're in the United States. Here's the thing, though. For most students that are on these visas, the time that you're in the United States, it tolls the counting of the substantial presence test. So that doesn't count toward whether you become a U.S. tax resident for that purpose. So instead, what happens is for basically your first 5 years that you're in the U.S. on one of these visas, you're going to be doing the 1040 NR because the substantial presence test probably isn't going to apply. So that's what you're basically looking at as you're trying to figure out which one of these you're going to be filing, whether you're going to be using the 1040 or the 1040 NR. So if this video has been helpful so far, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. That's going to help you keep up to date with this playlist that's going through international student tax, and it's going to walk through a 1040 NR as well as an 8843, so you can see how you actually complete those documents. But let's take a look at some mistakes that often are made by international students when they're starting to file their taxes. One of the first ones, they're going to be using the 1040 instead of the 1040 NR. That's a pretty big mistake. Incorrect credits, compliance issues, that results in fees and those types of issues, penalties. So you want to make sure you're using the correct form. So from the last test that we used, or if you're on one of those visas, you're generally going to be using the 1040 NR if you have any income from like W-2 or 1099. Now, another one is ignoring treaty rules. So I'll do a video that talks a little bit about the basics of treaties, but those help minimize your tax, right? A double tax treaty is designed to prevent double taxation, and it helps prevent you from overpaying taxes. If you ignore them, then you might be overpaying in your taxes. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you're only paying the amount of taxes that you're required to pay. Another one is going to be not filing that Form 8843. Remember, most individuals have to file, most international students have to file the Form 8843 every single year. So if you don't do that, then what happens is sometimes it starts getting counted towards your residency, because remember the 8843 is kind of pausing that. And then there could be some compliance issues as well. So you want to make sure that you're filing that 8843, even if you don't have to file the Form 1040 NR because you didn't have any income. You're still going to go ahead, you're going to do that 8843. The next one is claiming standard deductions, right? So unless you're from India, if you're from India, current rules, that doesn't apply to you. But outside of that, if you claim the standard deduction, then what happens is you're over claiming deductions, and you're going to start getting IRS notices, and you can run into some issues with that because you're taking too much of a deduction. You're not going to be in compliance. And then finally, claiming ineligible dependents or credits. Remember, when you're looking at the 1040 NR, you're not able to go ahead and take those dependents, or you don't qualify for many of the credits that are out there. So again, that can result in penalties, fees, notices, those types of issues. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding these mistakes. Also be very careful if you're using some type of accounting program, that sometimes what they do is they default you to the 1040. And if you're a 1040 NR and they push you to the 1040, you can run into those issues even though you're trying to comply with the tax code. So just make sure that you're getting that 1040 NR if you are supposed to be filing that 1040 NR, that the correct thing is being filed for you. All right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a summary that's going to show you all the differences, or many of the differences, between your 1040 and the 1040 NR that we've talked about so far. So let's go ahead and look at that final summary. All right, so let's go ahead and sum up everything that we just talked about. So this table, it addresses all the issues that we've been going through, and a couple others that I want to make sure I mention. But on the middle part of it, you see the Form 1040 for our residents, and then on the right-hand side, that's our 1040 NR for our non-residents. This helps you see the distinction between the two. And like I said before, I do have an entire playlist on the Form 1040 for the residents. So if you're filing a 1040, that can help you as you walk through the process. I also have a playlist that's developing that walks you through the basics, the intro to filing taxes. Now, when we're looking at this comparison, you can see we start out with who files, worldwide income. So yes for the 1040, no if you're a non-resident, 1040 NR. We have the standard deduction, which is going to be available to a resident but not to a non-resident. We had our itemized deductions. Both the resident and non-resident can go ahead and take itemized deductions, but a non-resident is going to be a little bit more restricted in terms of what is available under the itemized deductions. Filing statuses, so there's a little bit of a restriction if you're a non-resident, because it doesn't include married, filing jointly, and it doesn't include head of household. We also have our education credits. Now, I didn't discuss the education credits, but I did mention earlier in the video that a lot of times credits aren't going to be available for non-resident taxpayers. So if you're a non-resident taxpayer, what you may lose out on is the American Opportunity Tax Credit or the Lifelong Learning Tax Credit. So that would be something that's eligible for residents doing a 1040, but not for a non-resident having to do a 1040 NR. So the EIC is another tax credit. It's the Earned Income Credit. Again, eligible for a resident with a 1040, but not for anybody doing the 1040 NR in most situations. Then we went through and we talked about treaty benefits, filing deadlines, and then finally the required forms. Here's the last thing I want to leave you with. When you're doing the required forms on that, the W-2, the 1042S and the 8843, those are going to be things that you include with your tax return. Okay, those are going to be included on that portion of it. Now with that 8843, so you're going to include that 8843 with your 1040 NR if you're required to file the 1040 NR. Now in most instances, if you're not required to do a 1040 NR because you didn't earn any income, you didn't have a job, you didn't have a W-2, whatever it is, well, you're still going to do the 8843, so you still have to file the 8843. So the 8843 isn't dependent upon whether you have to do a 1040 NR. All right, I hope this video has been helpful. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel and be on the lookout for the next videos, which are going to be common mistakes when you're dealing with the 1040s NRs, and then also the two walkthroughs, the 8843 walkthrough followed by the 1040 NR walkthrough, so you can see how you actually complete these forms. Thank you.